In the name of God, shape our understanding and our course. Amen.
Amen.
Please be seated. I'm reminded of an insurance commercial that was on TV a few years ago. You may remember it. A few women of a certain age are gathered in one of their living rooms. The host proudly announces that she's saved a ton of time by posting her vacation photos to her wall instead of mailing them out. Clearly, it is meant as a reference to the Facebook wall, but the camera pans out and you see pictures literally taped up to the wall in her living room. One of the friends pushes back against her misunderstanding, and the host looks at her defiantly, presses an imaginary button in front of her, and announces, "Unfriended." The friend cries out, "That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works." The thing is, she was applying her experience, her worldview, to what she was hearing about. Her experience and worldview led her to know concretely what a wall is. So this new understanding of something so simple as a wall eluded her. There's something admirable about her attempt to adapt, but even so, she misses the mark. That's sort of how I see this story we hear today about Peter. It almost gives you whiplash. Just last week, as Jesus was exploring the idea of identity with the other disciples, Peter was lauded for his answer. He was proclaimed to be the rock. And he was told that he was the one on whom Christ would build the church. Peter would be its foundation, its strong support. But as Jesus goes on to talk about what that means, what this church in his name would look like, Peter freaks out a little bit. God forbid it, he says. This must never happen to you. You see, Peter was looking at his expectations for the Messiah through the lens of his own worldview and experiences. He had been taught from infancy that the people of God who had followed Abraham for these thousands of years would one day be lifted up, brought out of their suffering by a strong king, a Messiah anointed by God, to vanquish their oppressors and to lead them into freedom. The prophets of God and those who interpreted them had been teaching this for centuries. It's easy to get lost in the language of the story. Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan." It's harsh and it's jarring. But I almost hear it like that friend from the insurance commercial. I almost hear it as the same kind of exasperated cry, "That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works." Jesus had been teaching them all this time, and they still struggled to make sense of it. But in all sincerity, that sort of gives me comfort. And I hope it does you too. These disciples struggled to truly grasp the teachings of Jesus, and they had the best teacher imaginable. I've had some great teachers too, and even so, making sense of and following Jesus still feels like a lifelong pursuit. So I can't really fault Peter for getting it wrong. I've gotten many of the nuances of this faith wrong before, and I'm sure I will again. But really, the teaching here is this: look for the unexpected. God's will is uncovered in ways that elude us. God's plan is executed not according to our expectations or our timelines or even our outcomes, but through the wisdom of God. Sometimes that makes it feel like the goalposts are moving. I'm sure Peter must have felt that way. He'd finally figured it out. He'd finally gotten the kind of affirmation from Jesus that assured him that he was not only on the right track, but that he was ready to lead others down that track. He was a leader. He was the rock. But before he could even rest on those laurels, he was reminded in no uncertain terms that he still had a ways to go. There was still more to learn. There was still more about this plan and this faith that he needed to discern. The funny thing about the insurance commercial is that even though it wasn't really all that long ago, it would have zero relevance now. I'd bet teenagers today have never even heard of a Facebook wall. Now it's a timeline. Or maybe you'd share your pictures to your stories. Or more likely, you'd skip Facebook altogether and go right to Instagram. Because teens now think Facebook is for old people. They just go there sometimes to check on their aunts and uncles. And I'm sure there are other social media avenues that they're using now that I don't know or understand. The point is, the goalposts are moving. We live in a dynamic world. Just as much as we're called to be constantly growing, so is everyone else. And if we're all growing, everything around us is always going to be changing in one way or another. So when we try to use our understandings and experiences to impose our will or our expectations on an unwritten future, we will fail. Following Christ means being ready for the unexpected. In a couple of weeks, we'll have Bishop Hughes here with us. One of the real gifts that comes from a bishop's visitation to a congregation is that it spurs us to actively think about ministry outside of just our own context. It reminds us that we are building blocks of a future that is greater than anything any of us could do on our own. It will make us think about what is next, how we can prepare for the church of the future. But we would be wise to learn from the example of Peter. If we hold too tightly to our own experiences and expectations, we're likely to miss the mark. Just like that lady in the commercial. Just like the rock on whom Christ built the church. Even as we build, even as we strain toward what's next, we have to be learning. We have to be adapting. As always, we have to be growing. In short, we have to be following Christ. And we have to know that that will almost certainly take us to places that we had never imagined. We have to know that that's okay. We have to remember that there, in those places we never imagined, that's where we will find Christ. In the reading from Jeremiah today, it begins with Jeremiah lamenting that God hasn't supported him in the way that he expected. But in the end, God says to him, "They will fight against you, but they shall not prevail over you. For I am with you to save you and to deliver you." Even when we feel vulnerable and not up to the task, I encourage you to remember that. Remember that God has promised to be with us. God has promised to save us and to deliver us. Through whatever shifting changes the world may throw at us, knowing that will be enough to keep us on the right track. Amen.